Many Lifetimes, a book about reincarnation. And this is a continuation of Chapter 6. A question which I am often asked is whether every patient who is able to reach a deep state of hypnosis can be regressed to an earlier lifetime. In the majority of patients with whom, for one reason or another, I have used hypnosis, the need to explore an earlier lifetime has not arisen, and among those in whom I thought a previous personality might be relevant, only a small proportion have been able to recall a single episode. Even when a patient is intellectually convinced of the concept of reincarnation and only seeks empirical evidence of personal continuity, I cannot always help him to gain it. For instance, I had a patient who was so eager to have a glimpse of some episode in her long history so that she could speak about the concept with more authority that she devoted 12 sessions to this project, although the problem for which she had originally consulted me had already been resolved. I had had ample evidence that she was an excellent hypnotic subject, so when she said that her failure must be due to her inability to be hypnotized, I told her to hold her left arm out at a right angle and then suggested that she would forget about her arm until I told her to take it down. I brought her out of hypnosis, and Joan suggested that she might like to stay to tea. For an hour she sat, happily chatting, oblivious to the fact that her arm was still extended. Only when I told her to put it down did she realize what she had been doing. Needless to say, I should not have performed this elementary experiment unless I had known that it would not cause her even momentary discomfort. One might have thought that her eagerness for personal proof would have caused her imagination to produce some more or less convincing fantasy, especially as she had read all of Joan's books and had felt, as we did, even at our first meeting, that we were old friends. Certainly, she is a woman of outstanding integrity, but, contrary to my expectations, I have found that nearly every patient has shown the same determination not to fake. Considering the prevalence of claims to far memory, which to me seem obviously spurious, I find it interesting that even when a patient has recovered an episode which appears essentially plausible, although in fact it has become grossly distorted in transit to his present consciousness, it is often he who first questions its validity. It is widely held that patients tend to produce the type of material which will please their psychiatrist, but mine have seldom done so, presumably because their desire to be relieved of their symptoms was more important than the time-wasting ploy of trying to lead their therapist astray. It is also probable that Joan's presence at sessions acts as a deterrent to patients who might otherwise employ these imaginations in an attempt to delude or impress. Although there are occasions, for instance, if she is in pain or very tired when her faculties are temporarily inactive under normal conditions, she can tune into the episode which the patient is reliving, especially if the episode concerns a split-off fragment of one of his earlier personalities. She explained to me that the reason she finds it so easy to share the patient's identification with his ghost is not merely that she has had considerable experience of coping with this type of phenomenon, but because a ghost, by its very nature, has often repeated the circumstances in which its energy is bound, that the emotion is deeply etched, the situation clearly delineated, the background specific. I have found that it's very unusual for a patient to remember the name he bore in an earlier lifetime, or to be able to date an episode in which he was able to relive in his most graphic detail. This may be due to the fact that the incidents which my patients have recalled under hypnosis were directly concerned with the origin of their symptoms, and therefore are not memories which stemmed from integrated components of their personalities, but from the ghosts, which had become split off by some traumatic event. A ghost exists in a circumscribed present, which contains emotions and sensations, but no knowledge of matters which are primarily intellectual. For instance, the girl dying of hemorrhage would have thought of herself as I and not by name, and the date of the abortion would not have been associated with her pain and terror. Joan was able to date this girl's death and therefore to know that there was an interval of less than 2 years before she incarnated in a male body, only because the clothes which played such an important part in her fantasies were in the fashion of 1927, a fact which Joan happened to remember because it was the year she bought her trousseau. One of the very few occasions when a patient produced a date which was of intrinsic interest occurred in 1959. I can best describe him as a stalwart yeoman. Following an accident in which he wrenched his shoulder very severely, he had developed a disability in his right hand, which was not clearly due to any organic cause. He was referred to me in the hope that hypnotherapy might help where more orthodox psychiatric approach had failed. Except for his disability, he was in excellent physical health and mentally an exceptionally well-balanced man. He had gone to school at the age of 13 so as to be able to contribute to the support. No. Let me read that again. He had left school at the age of 13 so as to be able to contribute to the support of the family. And so far as I was able to discover, his historic knowledge was virtually non-existent. His creations were gardening, carpentry, and swimming. He seldom went to the cinema, had neither a radio nor a television, and was not interested in books. He entered hypnosis very easily, and he had been recounting some episode from his boyhood when he paused, and then he said, "I am 17, and I am very ill, but not so ill as some of the other sailors." As his current history had contained no mention of a severe illness or that he had ever been to sea, I asked, "When did this happen?" He replied without hesitation, "In 1567. While I was still assimilating the fact that my patient was now in the reign of Elizabeth I instead of Elizabeth II, he proceeded to describe his symptoms: the bleeding gums, the loosening teeth, the stinking breath, the bruises which appeared without any blow to cause them, and the increasing weakness. He described, in fact, a typical case of scurvy. After he had recounted many vivid scenes of experiences while an Elizabethan seaman, I asked him whether his ship had fought against the Armada. He seemed puzzled, and then he replied, "I do not know what you mean by the Armada." But when during the next session I asked, "How did you die?" he answered, "When did you die?" He answered, "In 1593, 5 years after we sank the accursed Spaniards." My memory for dates is exceedingly hazy, so I had to wait until I got home to confirm that the Spanish Armada was defeated in 1588, 5 years prior to the date that he had given for his own death. The reason he was puzzled when I first asked him about the Armada was, I feel sure, that he was regressed then to a period of his Elizabethan life, which had antedated this event by several years. Obviously, he could not remember a sea battle which, from that point of view, had not yet happened. When a patient is assisted by hypnosis, to release the energy which has become trapped in a fragment of a previous personality, he may either have an intense abreaction or else, while still attaining a therapeutic degree of identification, he may remain sufficiently detached to be both spectator and participant of the crucial event. I am not able to predict with any confidence which of these two courses a patient is likely to follow, nor if he encounters more than one ghost during his treatment that his reaction will be consistent. I presume, therefore, that the immediate impact of a recall depends on the energy content of the ghost and not on the qualities of the present personality. The recall of an event which occurred centuries ago can be as vivid as the memory of an automobile accident which occurred last week. In fact, more vivid, for one is insulated by the intervening clock time from a memory in normal waking consciousness. But a regression can have a sense of immediacy, which is enveloping and absolute. I gained empiric evidence of the intensity of such a recall on our first occasion that I relived an episode from my own long history. I was very doubtful of being able to recover anything, especially as hypnotists are notoriously difficult to hypnotize, and Joan has no experience in this particular technique. I advised her to follow the procedure which she had seen me use with the patients, but instead she lit a candle and told me to stare at the flame. She averred, A-V-E-R-R-E-D. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. She averred that this was a method of inducing a level shift that had once been commonplace to us both, and which I might again find effective. Although rather nettled that she was ignoring my advice, I fixed my gaze on the flame and gave myself suggestions of relaxation. The transition of a skeptical psychiatrist lying on his own couch to a man racing a chariot was instantaneous. On my left, there was a barrier surrounding an island of spectators in the center of the arena. On my right, a chariot was overtaking me. I knew I should give way to it, but instead I forced my pair into the narrowing gap. There was a shuddering impact as our wheels interlocked. I was catapulted forward and felt a wheel run over my chest as the chariot overturned. It swung the horses against the barrier. The last thing I remembered was their screaming. At this point, Joan brought me back to the present, but the terrible realization that, through a desire to show off, I had caused the destruction of a pair of beloved horses brought a degree of shame, which, to my current life, I had never previously experienced. There was no possibility of dissociating myself from this event. That it had occurred 2,000 years ago was entirely irrelevant. It was I who had done it, and it was happening now. For 48 hours I felt I would never be able to face myself again. Some months later, the thread of my debt to horses reappeared when Joan, for other reasons entirely, was recalling episodes from a life that we had shared, also as husband and wife in England at the end of the 18th century. Among the many details which emerged was that my life centered round horses. I bred them and I schooled them and sometimes gave one to a trusted friend, but I never sold any, which is probably why our house became increasingly dilapidated. So anxious was I never to cause them discomfort that I forbade steel to be put in their mouths, and I always rode them on a bit made of leather. My attempt to redress the equine balance must have persisted into my present life. Riding was my favorite hobby, and a horse I schooled during my period in the army only just missed being selected for a British Olympic show jumping team. But though I enjoyed show jumping, hunting, and the occasional point-to-point, I was a poor competitor because I could never bring myself to take an avoidable risk of injuring the horse. Joan, of course, knew of my interest in horses, but what she did not know, because it never occurred for me to tell her, was that I found the idea of putting steel in their mouths so distasteful that whenever possible I used a bit made of rubber. The incident of recalling a fragment of my own long history was soon followed by my first experience of handling an episode from a patient's earlier life without Joan's help. At this period, she was not working with me as a routine because she was finishing a book which had been commissioned before our meeting. The patient was a highly cultured professional man in his mid-40s who, since puberty, had been exclusively homosexual. In retrospect, it is surprising that in a case of this nature, I did not moot the possibility of reincarnation at an early stage. But there are two reasons why I did not do so. Firstly, as I cannot emphasize too often or too strongly, recognition that the current life is but the most recent of many is by no means a panacea. In the majority of cases, the root of a neurosis lies in the present, can be found in the present, and can be resolved in the present. Therefore, except in unusual instances, it would be foolish to omit a scrutiny of the patient's existing circumstances. And to understand these fully, a consideration of his childhood is sometimes unavoidable. Secondly, during our initial interview, this patient had declared that he was a staunch upholder of Orthodox Church of England doctrine, and from this I inferred that he might find the idea of reincarnation unacceptable. Success in therapy seldom depends upon a patient sharing this belief, and many treatments run their course without the concept being mentioned, but needless conflict evoked by introducing this highly controversial issue when it is not necessary can delay rather than accelerate the process. So, the first 13 sessions were devoted to exploring his present life, both with and without the aid of hypnosis. But I found nothing of sufficient emotional significance to account for the compulsive drive which caused him to seek a male companion as the only way of assuaging his loneliness. This loneliness was the core of his problems, for however long and arduously he tried to cure himself by being aesthetic, his self-imposed solitude eventually became intolerable. Then he would enter into yet another of the relationships which, as he expressed it, seemed foredoomed to failure and to leave me lonelier than ever. At the 14th session, he arrived in a state of acute agitation, due to the fact that since our last meeting, he had moved into a new apartment, and within 2 days, he had found himself strongly attracted to a young man living in the same building. I induced hypnosis with the intention of telling him to try to pinpoint what aspect of this particular young man had made him seem so desirable, but instead I found myself saying, "See who is causing you to have these feelings." Within seconds, He began to describe episodes from a life in which he had been the Hittite, Hittite, wife of the governor of the foreigners who have invaded my country. The marriage was at first exceedingly satisfactory, for she lived in unaccustomed luxury and was fawned upon by sycophants who knew that her husband often turned to her for advice. Then he received orders which would entail his absence from his headquarters for some considerable time, and by overruling his objections, she was able to accompany him. The questions concerning the direction of the march, the character of the terrain, and the number of days which elapsed between the various periods when the army went into temporary encampment, I tried to gain information about the scope and the aims of this campaign. Perhaps if my patient had been recalling his experiences as a soldier, he would have retained this kind of data. But the woman he had been remembered only the discomforts that she had suffered on this seemingly interminable journey, the aches and fevers, the heat and the boredom and the dust storms and the sand flies. When I asked how long did the journey last, the reply was, far, far longer than I had anticipated. The hardships which I was forced to endure destroyed my health and my beauty, and then my husband came no more to my tent to visit me. When she reached home, her bitterness increased. Her husband no longer asked her for advice, nor did he bother to conceal that neither her thoughts nor her body aroused his interest. Already acutely jealous, she became obsessed with hatred when she discovered that she had been supplanted, not by another woman, but by a handsome boy. This final humiliation caused her to steal her husband's dagger, so that it would become the object on which to focus the energy of a curse. I took it to a priest of Baal and paid him much gold to curse the owner of the dagger. May everything he finds sweet become bitter. May everyone he lives for die. I asked, when did you die? He cried out, I was soon murdered. I was stabbed. As he was obviously in considerable emotional distress, I brought him back to the present and out of hypnosis. He retained a clear memory of everything that he had recounted, and I asked him to give an opinion of the woman's character. He exclaimed, she was a terrible creature. She did not love her husband, even at the beginning. She only coveted the prestige that marriage to him would bring. She did not go with him on his journey because she wanted to share his hardships. She went only to prove to him that he could not do without her, and that, although a woman, she was stronger even than he. Her jealousy was wicked enough, but to inflict a curse upon him was an unforgivable sin. Knowing that he was truly devout, I said to him, imagine that you are a priest. Imagine that a woman has confessed this story to you. She understands the nature and the magnitude of her transgressions and has resolved never to act in this way again. What would you say to this woman? He replied without hesitation, I would give her absolution. So I asked him to absolve the woman who is part of his total self. He knelt in prayer. Of the form of his prayers, I know nothing. But even from my chair on the other side of the room, I could feel the beneficial energy which was flowing from him. At length, he rose to his feet, and I saw that the drawn, anxious expression on his face with which I had become so familiar had changed to a serene contentment. He said, "I know it is finished. I am no longer a homosexual." He came to see me some weeks later, but only to confirm that he was free and knew he would remain so. Then I did not hear from him for 4 years. His letter contained the sentence, "The cure, by the way, through far memory, and what I can only regard as your exorcism, has been effective indeed, and I have found myself able to enter wholly satisfactory heterosexual relationship."